Hi, welcome back. So, we are beginning week 4. This is our mini unit on sacred texts. Most of our readings are grouped together because they're from a similar part of the world and a similar time. This is not the case with this one. We are spanning a very long time and a whole lot of distance with this unit. As a result of that, our primary focus here is not going to be on that new historical, how is their world different than ours, because the answers can be very different for each of these. We are instead going to be treating these as sacred texts in their own right. Now, definitionally, a sacred text obviously is any text that is sacred to a group of people. That's a terrible definition. Don't use the word in a definition if you can help it. So, a sacred text is going to be a text that, for some group of people, holds lessons regarding um, regarding the rules of that particular group of people, which means it is inherently community oriented. Um, it means that it is going to be generative. People from that community are going to be working with that text and creating new texts based on that particular text. Um, and they are going to treat it as simultaneously mutable and immutable, which means that it is going to be ever changing while still staying the same because the culture is the thing that's going to change. Now, this is true of all works in the literary canon. We can treat anything in the literary canon as if it were sacred, but these are the ones that very particularly people in a given community, whether that is in ancient India or ancient China or in the early days of Christianity in the Greek and Roman empires, um, or wherever else. Um, these are the ones that they have particularly chosen as sacred. And I'm guessing most of you have not read all four of these before, unless you've also taken a class on world literatures. You may or may not belong to a faith for which one of these is a holy book. Please remember, I am not treating these as a holy book for our class. I'm treating it as sacred. I am not treating it as holy because we are treating it as a work of literature, as this is a literature class. So I might say things that don't completely jibe with the theology of people who for whom these texts are sacred. That is not me slighting them in any way. It's me treating it as something different than what they treat it as. And again, that is okay. Everybody brings their own background, their own literary theory. Um, with that in mind, I do want to use a couple of tools from my own background that I find to be extremely useful for sacred texts kind of across the board. A little bit about me. Um, I am technically Roman Catholic. Um, I was baptized as a Catholic shortly before I married my wife. Before that, I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I've been around the Catholic Church for just a crazy long time. Despite the fact that my parents were both Southern Baptist, the thing that I took from them is basically being non practicing. I haven't been to church since COVID started. Oh well. But within that tradition, obviously, me having gone to over a decade of Catholic school and then being a practicing member of the Catholic Church for the first, 6 or 7 years of my marriage, um, has given me a lot to work with from their particular set. And these are actually also part of Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, that podcast. So if you listen to that one, then this is going to sound really familiar to you, just because I like the way that they present it and it's very useful for a classroom format. The first one they're going to be working with is the idea of exegesis. The idea of exegesis is that you can sequentially peel away layers from a text and they build on each other. And as you get closer and closer to the middle, then you're going to get more and more meaning. So that's what it means to perform an exegesis on something. The very particular exegesis that we are going to be performing in here for this unit is called Lectio Divina. Um, which again, pulled from the Latin, don't get too hung up on the terms. But in Lectio Divina, there are four major steps that we're going to be using. There is the literal, there is the allegorical, there is the personal, and then there is the practical. So the first step, the literal, is just looking at a text and saying, what's going on in here? What happens before um, we look at this particular line, this particular section? Traditionally, Lectio Divina is performed by you choose a random line, you just flip through and put your finger on it, or you do a numerological thing and you pick a number and then you pick a line and then you look up what those things are. That's kind of how um, it's chosen, because the idea is that anything is going to be worthwhile in a sacred text. It's going to be worthy of analysis and critical thought and of understanding. So that is step one. Is just literally what's going on, what just happened, what are the characters doing, what are they reacting to. It's the same kind of thing you would know if you were just reading through the book as if it were a book. um, but we have to get kind of that foundation in order for it to make sense. So that is step one, the literal. Step two is the allegorical. What does this remind you of? Very particularly, since this is a literature class, what other things does this connect to for you in the greater world of literature? So, is there a word in there that you can connect to other texts that feel like they are from other texts? Um, or is there a theme in there that feels familiar to you or reminds you of another character or another situation from a different work of literature? So allegorically, like what are the connections we can make outside of the text once you've made that connection inside the text? Step three is the personal. And in the personal step, it's not how does this connect to other texts, but how does this connect to your own life? So what have you been through, or what do you think is likely that you will go through that is related to this one? How are you similar or different from these characters that show up in this particular little snippet that we're working with? And then the fourth one is based on that personal connection. What do you feel like this text is calling you to do in this moment? Again, sacred texts traditionally within their communities are thought of as holding rules or holding suggestions for how to function in the world. So if this text is telling you how to function in this world, what is it telling you to do? Either similar to or different from how the characters in this text are doing it, or the related text that you came up with in step two, or how you have handled it in the past. How should you do it differently? Um, Things like that. So that's one, two, three, four. Literally, what's going on in the text? Allegorically, what does this remind us of in other text? Personally, how does this connect to our own life? And then practically, what is this telling us to do? Another sacred reading practice that, again, pulling from the Christian tradition here, this is the one we're actually doing for our journal this week, is sacred imagination. Long story short, founder of the Jesuit order, Ignatius of Loyola, was a soldier, and then he got shot with a cannonball, and he survived, which is not something that happened a whole awful lot back in the day. But he did. He survived, but he was on bed rest for like months, and he was just sitting there reading the Bible. Um, and he found that if he imagined himself into the story, that he would get more out of it. And really, his only rule of this is if it makes you a better member of the community or better at loving your community, then you are doing it correctly. So he would literally sit and read the Gospels of Jesus, just like the Gospels that we're going to be reading a little bit later this week. But he would imagine himself as a character, as a bystander, or as one of the followers of Jesus, or as one of the Romans, or as one of the Hebrew characters, or whoever else. Um, he would picture himself into this, and what would he see? What would he hear? What would he smell? What would he taste? What would it feel like? Um, what would be going through his head as these characters are doing things or as they're talking to each other? Um, what would cause him to say something in response? What would he be thinking there? If he's just watching it, then how do each of these reactions what do they make him think about? What do they make them feel? Um, as a way to better understand it, which is actually going to feel extremely familiar to those of you who are neurodivergent, because we tend to do that um, more than the average person. But if you're the kind of person who usually just thinks in words, I'm guessing you haven't done that a whole lot. That's mostly for people who think either in images or in 3D space. Um, So this can be an extremely useful practice as well. So, imagine yourself listening to this conversation between these two characters. What is your reaction to it, not as one of those two characters, but as a third party who just happens to be standing by? Um, and theater people like to do this too. So if you're in the theater program, hey, this is probably going to sound relatively familiar to you. But doing it in a sacred way, again, the purpose is not only to better understand ourselves, but to better understand what's going on in the text. Um, and if you feel like it makes you a better person, then you did it right. If it makes you feel angry and bitter, maybe you didn't pick the best character for that particular piece. You couldn't have known. There's nothing wrong with that. Or maybe that's what it's trying to tell you about that character. Who knows? Um, there are plenty of others we can do. I really like working with Florilegia as a practice as well. It's the one that English teachers have been recommending for decades at this point in the classroom, where you make notes for yourself either in a journal or on the side of the text, and then you put those in conversation with each other and use them to create their own text. As a folklorist, I actually do a lot of studying of that with the things people write in bathroom graffiti. Gotta tell you, since COVID started, there's not been a whole lot of it, but there have been some winners over in Romer, I'll tell you that much. Um, the Lark, not so much, I found. Um, but that's kind of how we're treating these this week. So we're taking a little bit of a break from New Historicism. We are still going to be working with American Pragmatism, but we're also primarily working with these sacred reading practices as well. So keep those in mind as you're going through, and feel free to practice them as you're working on it outside of the assignments. It's just a really good way to engage yourself with the text. It only takes a minute or two if you get a little bit of practice at it. So it's a worthwhile skill. All right. See you guys at the end of the week. As always, email me if you've got any questions.